All right, welcome back from spring break, everybody. We've only got like 2 weeks till our Easter break, so we're gonna get rolling. Oh, why is this hissing? All right. Mm, Okay, cool. Okay, so before we get started, just a couple of announcements, things to know since we've been away for a while, been hibernating potentially, or enjoying ourselves. So if you were looking for a video from Friday, the day before break, you won't find one because of spring break coming and all that snow. When we started class, there were like less than 10 people here. So we made a group decision to just cancel class on the spot and get started fresh after spring break. So that's why you have no video and why we didn't do a quiz. So we'll just roll this stuff all into our quiz for next week. Second thing, we did have an exam before break, so I wanted to make sure you have some exam stats for that. Seems like it was a little bit tough, but good effort on it. Our median was an 82. We did have about 21% in the A minus range. I did do an item review after the exam. I do look through our question statistics to check that things were fair and there wasn't like a question everybody got wrong, in which case it's probably more a me problem than a you problem. So there were two questions that I thought were unnecessarily confusing or tricky. So if you saw your score change, that's because I accepted an alternate answer for one of them and gave partial credit for one of the answers on another. If you didn't, you probably got it right in the first place. Okay, and our final thing is that while we have class today on Wednesday, the biology department is having an advisement event, an advisement day from 11 to 2. So we won't be meeting in person. You'll have a video on the anatomy of the renal system instead, and an assignment to go with that. Feel free to stop by the advisement event. You'll see it in the hallway. There'll be a couple snacks. There'll be people from the advisement office able to give you advice on courses, course selection and stuff. So even if you're not a bio major, you're welcome to stop by. You're officially invited by me. Okay. Oh, and one last thing on that topic of advisement, as you're thinking about your courses for next semester, I just wanted to let you all know that we do offer an anatomical dissection course that runs in both the fall and the spring. So in the fall, we do musculoskeletal dissections and the brain. And then in the spring, we're doing all those organs that you're seeing in lab right now. So lungs, heart, all that good stuff. So if you're interested in that, it's kind of fun. It's not particularly like your anatomy labs this semester, this year, because it's really more based on getting those dissection skills and kind of following your own interests. If you're interested in going into some form of surgery or healthcare in the future, a lot of healthcare programs start with a dissection-based gross anatomy course. So we got some facts about that, and let me know if you're interested. Okay. And I put that up on our Brightspace too. Okay. So that's it for announcements. So we're going to get into this unit. So our first piece here is going to link up what we've been covering in the lungs and the respiratory system to what we're going to be doing with the kidneys and our renal system. So this first piece is a little weird because it pulls from the end of your respiratory chapter and then also the end of one of your kidney chapters in the textbook. So just be aware that you got to look in both those places to get the full picture as we're thinking about our acid-base homeostasis. Okay. So we're going to talk about pH in the blood, what we think of as disturbances, and we'll start with the respiratory part since we're moving from our respiratory system, and then we'll jump to the kidney part next. Okay. So first things to know, pH is all about acids and bases, right? We've got a pH scale that goes from 0 to 14. In your chemistry class, you'd have 7 in the middle. When we're thinking about your body and we're thinking about the blood, we want to think about our middle, our normal range. It's being a little higher than that, a little basic, but our normal baseline is going to be around 7.4. So 7.35 to 7.45. To regulate that, it's really important to keep your blood pH in this range, because if you have too many hydrogen ions swimming around in your blood, it's going to mess with all the proteins in particular. And proteins do everything in your body, right? Our receptors are proteins. We've talked about how receptors control your nerves, control your heart. We're going to see more. We know about the clotting proteins. There are lots of proteins in your blood. Proteins are really important. So this is why we got to keep our pH in this range. This is what they're expecting. Okay, so we can do that with our breathing partially, and we can also change pH using our kidneys, using the renal system. Okay, so we're going to think of anything below 7.35 as acidosis. So your blood is too acidic. And what that means, right, is you have too many hydrogen ions, because the pH scale is based, that H is based on the hydrogen ions. And anything above our normal range, we're going to think of as alkalosis. So that's our basic part, the alkalosis. This means we have too few hydrogen ions. All right. Okay. So we want to stay in that normal range. You got a little bit of wiggle room that you can survive on either side. But if you get too far away from that normal range, this can be fatal in seconds, right? Above 8 or below 6.8, you are dead, right? So it's really important that as we see shifts in the blood pH, we get them under control quickly. All right. So this is because of those proteins, all our different types of proteins. You remember how proteins work, right? We have those polypeptides made of amino acids. They're all folded up, right? All those amino acids have those R groups, right? They all interact with whatever they're touching, right? So one of the things they interact with is acidity, basically. They interact with ions, those hydrogen ions, right? So if we have hydrogen ions changing around our proteins, changing the charge around proteins, the shape of that protein is going to change, right? That foldedness is all based on charges and interactions between atoms and parts of that polymer. If we see a change in a shape of a protein, right? Think about enzymes. Enzymes are also proteins, right? If you see a change in a shape in an enzyme, it's not going to bind to the right thing anymore, right? So your proteins aren't going to function if they're the wrong shape. pH could make them that wrong shape. So in terms of what kinds of general effects you'd see if we have too high or low a pH, got too low a pH, too acidic, acidosis, too many hydrogen ions, our overall effect is going to look like a depressed central nervous system. So you're going to think about like comas, right? We're going to be really slow. You'll notice fatigue. You'll see changes in breathing, heart rate, right? So that's going to be, in general, what we observe with acidosis. In alkalosis, you're going to see kind of hyperactivity, right? Remember, our nerves are responding and using changes in the sodium and potassium ions, but also other ions, cross those membranes to send their action potentials. So if you're in alkalosis, so too basic, too high a pH, you're going to see things like twitchiness, right? Hyperactive nerves and a hyperactive central nervous system. Okay. So if either of those go too far, that's bad. Okay. So we're going to be thinking about adjustments and how we can change our pH, how we can have homeostatic regulatory mechanisms. So I want you to think about other classes, or if you've skimmed your textbook, how could we change our pH, right? So for this question, we're going to imagine our pH goes down, so we become too acidic. What are some things that we think could bring us back to normal, bring us back up to this 7.35, 7.45 range? Okay, let's take a look. Okay, cool. Yes, these two most popular answers are correct. All right, so you might remember buffers from chemistry class. If you don't, basically how buffers work is they're gonna soak up, in this case, our acidity. All right, so that's one way that we can bring our pH back up. All right, and we have a low pH. If we're too acidic, what this really means is we have too many hydrogen ions. So maybe they're binding into that buffer, or we can actually just get rid of some hydrogen ions. That would be another way to fix this problem, to bring us back into the normal range. So as we go through this section, thinking about acid-base balance, we're going to see that your body does both of these things, right? We're going to have kind of a 1, 2, 3 steps of how we adjust our pH. The first one is going to be our buffers, right? So buffers work like a sponge for our hydrogen ions, basically, right? So one of our buffers, although actually not the most important one, but one of our buffers that we've seen already is hemoglobin. So hemoglobin can bind on to some of these hydrogen ions, and then it can also release hydrogen ions, right? A buffer doesn't get rid of a hydrogen ion forever, just kind of temporarily holds it, just like a sponge can soak up water, but you can also squeeze a sponge and water comes out. So the way that would work with hemoglobin, right, is we have our oxyhemoglobin can soak up essentially our hydrogen ions, giving us deoxyhemoglobin. And then our deoxyhemoglobin can go the opposite direction, right? It can bind on those hydrogen ions. Usually it's the deoxyhemoglobin we're thinking about when we think about hemoglobin working as a buffer. It has a greater affinity for hydrogen ions. So hemoglobin that doesn't have oxygen on it. Okay. For our purposes, you want to think of that as kind of a fun fact. Our more important buffer is going to be our bicarbonate ion. Okay. So what we're looking at here, right? We're looking at bicarbonate ions, right? So they're negative, right? We have our hydrogen ions are positive, right? And the way this would work as a buffer, right, is we take these two, bind them together, right? Because those charges attract. We get our carbonic acid, which we have actually seen before. We've seen this equation in the reverse before, because that carbonic acid can also be broken into carbon dioxide and water, right? So before, I mentioned that carbon dioxide can act as a biological acid because carbon dioxide and water can turn into carbonic acid, can turn into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. But now we're thinking about the reverse, right? Bicarbonate soaking up hydrogen ions. So this would all depend on amounts, basically, right? So you're going to use bicarbonate ions as a buffer and go this direction for the equation when you have too much hydrogen in your blood, right? And when you have too low a pH, really. Okay. So this is why carbon dioxide acts as a respiratory acid, because we have this relationship between hydrogen ions, bicarbonate, and carbon dioxide. And you might immediately be looking at this and thinking, "Oh, okay, but why an acid if it's making both hydrogen ions and bicarbonate?" What that's going to come down to is that this isn't a one-to-one relationship when we think about the effect on pH in our bloodstream, right? We're going to be looking for a specific ratio of hydrogen ions to bicarbonate ions, but also carbonic acid, this middle step, to bicarbonate ions. And as you notice, you're going to need a lot more bicarbonate in your blood compared to our acids to stay in that normal range, right? So if you break down to 1 and 1, you change this ratio and you overall make your blood more acidic. Okay. I'm not going to make you calculate this stuff. You may have done it in one of your chemistry classes, though. What we're looking at here is our Henderson-Hasselbalch equation. Right? So this is the equation for how you actually get a number for pH. Right? This is where those values come from, whether they're low or high. Right? So we got an equation. We have this constant 6.1, and we add the log of, for our purposes, our bicarbonate ions. Now we're going to think about carbon dioxide, mainly because carbon dioxide is what the lungs are going to be adjusting when we think about the role of the lungs in our pH and our acid-base balance. Right? Okay. So we're looking for an expected ratio of bicarbonate ions to carbon dioxide, just like we're looking at on the previous slide. We could transform this equation and think about carbonic acid, right? These are all kind of interchangeable in your bloodstream, right? And so to get our pH of around 7.4, you need this ratio to be 20 bicarbonate ions to 1 carbon dioxide molecule. Right? So anytime we get away from this ratio, we're going to change our pH. Okay? So too much carbon dioxide is going to make our pH go down. Too little carbon dioxide is going to make it go up. All right. So when we think about how our respiratory system and our renal system, so our lungs and our kidneys, affect our blood pH, we're going to think about them as regulating different parts of this, right? So our lungs are going to be regulating that carbon dioxide part, right? And hopefully after our last unit, that makes sense, right? You breathe out carbon dioxide. So if you change your breathing, especially if you speed up your breathing, you're going to be able to breathe out more carbon dioxide. And so by changing our respiratory rate, changing the number of breaths per minute, we can change pH. What we haven't talked about yet, but we'll be going into in detail in this unit, are our kidneys and our renal system. So the kidneys are going to be working on this bicarbonate part. They will also work on the overall concentration of hydrogen ions themselves. But when we're looking at this equation in this form, we're thinking about this buffer. Right? So your kidneys are going to be able to make bicarbonate. They're going to be able to move bicarbonate in and out of the bloodstream. Right? So they can adjust our pH by adjusting that piece. And you can fix this ratio, make it 20 to 1, using either side, right? You can add and subtract carbon dioxide, or you can add and subtract bicarbonate to get back to where we need to be. Which is good because sometimes pH is going to go off because there's something wrong with your breathing, something wrong with your respiratory system. And sometimes your pH is going to be off because your kidneys are malfunctioning. Okay. So when we think about the balance of acids and bases in our blood, right, our pH balance essentially in our bloodstream, we can have problems related to our breathing. And we're going to think of those as respiratory acid-base disturbances when we discuss them formally, right? So when we have too much acidity in the bloodstream, too many acids because of carbon dioxide, right? That's what we're going to call respiratory acidosis, right? So our carbon dioxide is acting as our acid in this case. So too low a pH because of your breathing, because of your lungs, respiratory acidosis. Same thing for alkalosis. So if the pH gets too high, and it's because of that carbon dioxide, but in this case, because you don't have enough carbon dioxide, I usually think of our bodies as wanting to get rid of carbon dioxide, but we do have expected values of carbon dioxide in our bloodstream as well. Right? We remember those partial pressures that we expect to see in arteries and veins, right? We know our partial pressure of carbon dioxide in our systemic arteries is supposed to be at 40, and then in the veins going back to our lungs, it's supposed to be at 46, right? So if it's far off from that, that's also a problem if it's too low, right? So respiratory alkalosis, it's not enough carbon dioxide, leading to this higher pH, this more basic pH. Okay. And we're specifying this respiratory piece. I'm circling it because when we get through this whole slide deck, right, we're going to be linking together, okay, how do we tell, looking at different values in the blood, do we have lung pathology? Is there something wrong with the lungs, or is there something wrong with the kidneys? And which of those two systems is compensating and trying to fix it? All right, so this is how we're going to refer to it if it's a problem with the lungs. Okay, so now we're going to jump to our kidney chapter and kind of review some of this and add on some new stuff. Okay. So the part of this that's in the lung chapters is pretty short. More of this is going to be found at the end of the renal system chapters. Okay. So we got our normal pH that we're expecting, around 7.4. So we got a 0.05 wiggle room on either side. For too low, acidosis, too high, alkalosis. Okay. It's a problem if we're outside this range because our proteins change shape. Proteins change shape. They're not going to work as enzymes. They're not going to work as receptors. Who knows? Maybe those clotting factors are affected. There are proteins all over your body. They're not going to work if they change shape. Overall effects, acidosis, you're going to have less activity, particularly in your nerves. We're most worried about the neurons in your brain and the central nervous system. Alkalosis, too much firing, right? And that causes too many contractions, too much activity. That's not good either, right? Now, there are downstream effects of this acidosis and alkalosis too, beyond our central nervous system. One of those is that there happens to be a sort of trade-off between hydrogen ions and potassium ions, potassium balance in your bloodstream. So we're also going to see that when you're in states of acidosis, so when the pH is too low, right, too many hydrogen ions, you're also going to end up with something called hyperkalemia. Okay. So when you see hyperkalemia, right, you're going to look for that K in the middle. Potassium ions, remember, are K plus, right? So that's how you're going to recognize this word. Right, so acidosis is going to be linked to hyperkalemia, and alkalosis is going to be linked to hypokalemia, so too low potassium. Right? So those can also be problems resulting from this pH balance. And when you have issues with potassium, some of the effects you're going to be most worried about are going to be in the heart, right? Potassium balance is particularly important for heart function and keeping a normal heart rhythm. So you can cause cardiac arrhythmias as we see these kind of cascading effects changing our potassium ion balance. We won't go all the way back through how our ions work when we're thinking about heart rhythms and heart functions, but hopefully you remember that we were interested in things like sodium ions, potassium ions, calcium ions while we were looking at heart function. Um, we also see effects in your blood vessels when we have issues with pH. This is because we change the function of catecholamines, but like epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine also get affected by the pH of your blood. So overall, we can see effects like too much vasodilation. We know that might affect our blood pressure because of the different functions of those hormones and neurotransmitters. So lots of kind of overall effects, bad effects that are going to happen if we've got the wrong pH. Okay. So from our respiratory unit, we know that part of the balance of pH in our blood is due to the lungs. Right? But we want to have a kind of bird's eye view of everything that's going on when we think about why the pH of our bloodstream might be changing, right? So we're going to think of some of it as being our respiratory system, but a lot of it has to do with maybe your behavior, right? So could have something to do with your diet, right? Some of the acidity of your blood in particular that you're going to expect to see going to come from proteins and fats. So you want to think about, right, amino acids, right? If you're trying to remember those proteins, right? Amino acids are acids, right? So that adds to acidity. Fats have fatty acids, right? Okay. So both of those could add to the concentration eventually of things like hydrogen ions. Okay. Right. Or we might think about effects of metabolism, so of breaking down our food, doing cellular respiration. Right? So carbon dioxide is one of our byproducts of breaking down glucose. Right? That's our more expected pathway when we're thinking about metabolism, the one we really focused on in A&P1. Right? But we also know that if we don't have enough oxygen, we'd be producing lactate as we do glycolysis over and over and over again. Right? So lactic acid could add to the acidity of your blood. If you're breaking down proteins and fats, you might also be producing keto acids as a byproduct of metabolism of those other types of macromolecules. So that can also add to the acidity of your blood. So from the input side, we got all sorts of things that are affecting our blood pH. And from the output side, though, it's a little simpler. We're just thinking about our lungs and their effects on carbon dioxide and our other output of acids. It's going to be from our hydrogen ions that are going to be exported by the kidneys. Right? So these are two ways to get rid of acidity from our bloodstream. Okay. So remembering that our carbon dioxide acts as an acid, right? We just saw that also in the respiratory piece, right? Carbon dioxide, water, carbonic acid, turning to bicarbonate ions, right? And hydrogen ions, right? But because they're 1-to-1 instead of 20-to-1 overall, our effect here is going to be excessive acidity, right? So respiratory disturbances, changing our pH, right? So our normal expectation for our partial pressure of carbon dioxide in our arteries is at 40, right? We know that we have reflexes that help keep us at that expected value, right? We had our chemoreceptors that are responsive to carbon dioxide, to hydrogen ions, and sometimes to oxygen, right? That can change our breathing rate in order to adjust our carbon dioxide levels. It was at the very end of our last unit, right? So we could output carbon dioxide through the respiratory system if we've got too much, right? And if we think about why we might have too much carbon dioxide, right? Because we're not breathing out enough, but ultimately that carbon dioxide that we're breathing out is coming from your cells making ATP through metabolism. Okay? And when we think about too much or too little carbon dioxide, we're thinking about respiratory, right? So breathing, acidosis, if it's too much carbon dioxide, too much acid, because carbon dioxide's working as an acid, too little carbon dioxide, respiratory alkalosis. Right? I'm sorry, there's weird repetition in this slide deck. It's because of those two chapters being kind of merged together here. Okay, so respiratory issues, carbon dioxide, too much carbon dioxide, respiratory acidosis, too little, respiratory alkalosis. Promise it'll all come together. Okay, so those are respiratory disturbances, right? Problems with our breathing, problems with our lungs, creating a pH imbalance. But we also have problems coming from other sources, right? So if it's coming from anywhere other than your breathing, your pH is wrong for any other reason, we're going to refer to it as metabolic acidosis, right? So mainly, ultimately, we're going to think about this as being kidney problems, but really, if we're taking our huge bird's eye, big picture view, just anything that's not breathing, we're shoving in this bucket, right? So this means that if you have a really, really high protein diet and you're not getting rid of enough hydrogen ions, if you're not adjusting for that, that could create metabolic acidosis. Same thing with a high fat diet because of all those fatty acids, right? Or super heavy exercise will ultimately create a buildup of lactic acid, right? Also metabolic acidosis. And we also might have our kidney issues that we'll dial in on in more detail as we go through the renal system. Okay. So for these two, you want to think about the bicarbonate part. Okay. So these are too much acid. These last two bits are often going to be because we don't have enough of that buffer in our bloodstream, right? So bicarbonate is supposed to be soaking up some of those hydrogen ions, buffering it out, adjusting if you're eating more protein or more fat, right? We're supposed to have wiggle room for ourselves so that we can change our diet day to day and not see issues with the pH in our blood, right? But if you don't have enough bicarbonate in your blood, it can't do that, right? If we don't have enough sponges, we can't adjust as easily. So when we see loss of bicarbonate for any reason, right, that may be one of our sources of acidosis. So one might be that you have something like severe diarrhea and you're just like pooping out too much bicarbonate, right? That might be a loss of bicarbonate, or might be because of the kidneys themselves. Your kidneys are supposed to be they're going to filter out all kinds of things from your bloodstream. We'll go through that, but including bicarbonate. And then they're supposed to take that bicarbonate and put it back into your bloodstream so that you keep enough bicarb in your blood to act as a buffer. In later parts of the kidney, they're also able to make some bicarbonate and do more fine-tuning adjustments, right? So if we have renal dysfunction, if your kidneys aren't working properly, there might be an issue with one of those pieces, right? There might be problems where you're not making bicarbonate when maybe you should be. So that's how renal dysfunction can add to this loss of bicarbonate, right? Okay. So those are all reasons for acidosis, for your pH becoming too low, too acidic. But you can also have alkalosis due to things other than your breathing. So metabolic alkalosis, anything that's not about carbon dioxide, anything that's not about breathing is going to be metabolic alkalosis. So this might be vomiting. Your stomach has a lot of stomach acid, right? That's part of how we break down food. And it's part of how you prevent things like food poisoning by creating really acidic environment that hopefully kills off a lot of bacteria and stuff that you might accidentally be eating. If you are vomiting a ton, stomach acid is one of the main things that's coming out of your mouth, right? So excessive vomiting ultimately causes you to have too few hydrogen ions in your body. Too few hydrogen ions means your blood is going to be too basic. That's the alkalosis piece. You could also end up in metabolic alkalosis if you like eat a ton of baking soda. Baking soda is basically just bicarbonate, right? So if you consume a lot of alkaline products, for example, baking soda, probably the most accessible alkaline product to you, right? You might ultimately accidentally change your blood pH, right? And finally, your kidneys messing up, renal dysfunction can go both ways. So if your kidneys aren't working properly, right, they might be leaving too much bicarbonate in your blood, just in the same way, but opposite to how they could result in you having too little bicarbonate in your blood. Right? Depends exactly what's going wrong with the kidney. Okay. So if we have a problem with the acid-base balance in our blood, right? If our pH is off, too low acidosis, too high alkalosis, either respiratory, so our carbon dioxide, or metabolic, anything else, we're going to see kind of over time, we got 3 lines of defense. So the first thing that's going to happen if we're going to focus mainly on acidosis for this piece, but it can also just alkalosis because our buffering is really a sponge, right? First thing that's going to happen immediately, really quick, is going to be buffering of hydrogen ions, right? So if your hydrogen ion concentration rises, which is acidosis, a low pH, right? Your chemical sponges are going to soak up those excess hydrogen ions. If you had too few hydrogen ions, you might think about like squeezing the sponge, right? Putting more hydrogen ions into the blood. Since these buffers should already be in your bloodstream, and the main one we're thinking about is bicarbonate, but there are others like hemoglobin, which we just mentioned. We're also going to see that some proteins actually can act as a buffer as well. Right? They should already be in your blood though, so they can immediately kind of adjust that hydrogen ion concentration. Now, that's not going to fix what's going wrong in your body, right? You haven't like fixed your lungs, you haven't fixed your kidneys by soaking up or squeezing out some hydrogen ions, but it's going to stop you from seeing symptoms of alkalosis or acidosis, right? We do have ways to actually fix the pH change though as well, right? So those are going to be from our breathing, from our lungs, or from our kidneys, from the renal system. So notice the difference here from our slides about sources of the disturbances is now instead of saying respiratory acidosis, respiratory alkalosis, we're thinking about compensation, right? So when we see these phrases, all we're saying is where is this coming from? And then if you see acidosis or alkalosis, that's telling you the respiratory system is a problem. If you see respiratory compensation, right? We're saying that the respiratory system is fixing the issue, okay? So after we use up buffers in our blood, right, the next easiest thing to do is just change your breathing rate, right? So you can just breathe faster or slower as need be to adjust carbon dioxide levels, right? So this would actually reverse a change in pH because that carbon dioxide acts as an acid, right? So if you let a little more carbon dioxide build up in the bloodstream as you're doing respiratory compensation, right, that means you'll bring the pH up, right? So you're going to be able to adjust our, did I say that the right way? Yeah. If you have alkalosis, you can bring the acid. Sorry, guys. You can adjust the carbon dioxide levels in order to adjust the pH, right? If you don't have enough acidity, you can add in carbon dioxide. If you have too much, you can get rid of extra carbon dioxide. What I meant to say. So that's from the lungs. Renal compensation is coming from our kidneys. And for this, we do want to know a little bit about the anatomy and our sort of filtration, absorption kind of words as relates to the renal system. So I'm going to draw us a quick picture in the corner, but that's what your video on Wednesday is going to be about. All right. So ultimately, you want to think about your kidneys. We're going to make them orange for now. We're going to have something called a nephron. It's going to look a little like this. Okay. It's a tube. It's got a shape. And ultimately, what comes out the end is urine. Right? So your urine's going to go to your bladder. You can pee stuff out. Okay. And we're also going to have blood flow going all next to this tube. All right, so we're going to have blood here, and it's going to continue, and we're going to see your blood continuing along the rest of our nephron here. Okay. So we're going to be moving stuff in and out of this nephron, in and out of this tube. So a lot of these, two of these words are going to be the same as when we talked about capillaries. Two of them will be a little bit newer, but hopefully closer to normal English. So hopefully not too hard to remember. All right, so for directions, when we have something coming out of the bloodstream, just like in the capillaries, when stuff came out of the blood, we have filtration. Next, if you have stuff go back into the blood, now because it's going back in after being filtered, this is now reabsorption, but it's the same direction as when we were talking about absorption without the re in our capillaries. Reabsorption. Okay. And then we're also going to see secretion and excretion. So secretion is when later on in this tube, you have more stuff coming out of the blood. So same direction as filtration, but just in a different spot. So when you secrete stuff, it's happening like here. It'll happen in multiple places. We'll get through it, but we can think about them in this order for now. Secretion. And then when you see the word excretion, we're really just thinking about peeing stuff out. So excretion is anything that makes it into your urine and out of your body. Okay. The reason I'm pointing that out right now is so that we can understand these next two bullet points here. Okay. So for renal compensation, okay, if we see that hydrogen ion concentration increasing in our blood, right? So you're thinking about extra hydrogen ions swimming all through your bloodstream everywhere, right? One of the things that we can do to compensate, one of the things we can do to fix this, right, is to increase our secretion of hydrogen ions. right? So we can take hydrogen ions, put them into this tube called the nephron, and then ultimately they're going to end up in your urine and leave your body, right? So that's one way we can fix it, right? Other way we can fix it is add more buffer to our bloodstream, right? So that would be this reabsorption part, right? We get rid of hydrogen ions out of your body through secretion, or we could pull more bicarbonate into your bloodstream through reabsorption. Okay. So those are ways we can fix acidosis because we are getting rid of those excess hydrogen ions or adding more buffer. You can also synthesize new bicarbonate and put that into the bloodstream. So kind of same direction here as our reabsorption. We can also fix alkalosis with our kidneys, right? So in this case, we would decrease how many hydrogen ions we're secreting, right? So they're going to stay swimming in your bloodstream for longer. We're going to have more of them sticking around in your bloodstream. So we are going to be increasing the acid content of your bloodstream. So we're fixing alkalosis by keeping those hydrogen ions around, keeping them in the blood. Likewise, we can decrease that reabsorption of bicarbonate. So now we got a little less buffer in the blood too. So we're going to let those hydrogen ions build up to bring us back to normal. Okay. So buffering is that quickest piece, right? So this can happen pretty much immediately when we see changes to pH because we can soak up hydrogen ions, or we can take our buffer, squeeze out those hydrogen ions and put them back into the blood. Most important one is bicarbonate when we're thinking about our buffers. We mentioned if we're thinking about things we've seen already as we think about the blood and our respiratory system, that hemoglobin can act a little bit as a buffer. There are also buffers that exist inside your cells. So that's what ICF is there, right? So ECF in that first piece, the bicarbonate is in extracellular fluid. So we're thinking in your plasma, just kind of loose and free in the blood. In your cells, you also have buffers that can adjust pH. So proteins and some phosphates can buffer out acidity inside a cell. So the one I want you to really remember is this bicarbonate. Second line of defense, pretty easy to adjust your breathing. Couple minutes when we're thinking about how long it takes to either build up some more carbon dioxide or to get rid of a little extra carbon dioxide, right? So when we're regulating our pH by changing our ventilation, right? So by changing how much air we're moving in and out per minute, right? If we increase our ventilation, right? So we breathe a bit faster, increase our respiration rate, we're going to be breathing out extra carbon dioxide. So more acid is leaving your body. So we're going to bring our pH up, right? If we slow down our breathing, we're going to build up acid levels, build up carbon dioxide in the bloodstream, right? So we're going to be bringing pH down by reducing our respiration rate. Okay. So we'll stop here for today. I do just want to give you a heads up for where we're eventually going on this. All right. We're going to go through all the pieces of how we adjust this stuff using our breathing and our kidneys. Ultimately, our goal is going to be able to look at what's going on in a blood sample, look at what the pH is, what our carbon dioxide level is, what our bicarbonate level is, and to figure out what the source of our problem is and how we're going to fix it. Okay. So if you want to look through this flow chart as you're preparing for Friday, this is our goal.